me know. Let's open with a word of prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Don.
Restrooms for anybody?
Restrooms, the men and women's is my left, your right, out of the sanctuary here. So the women's is close, and then the men's is just past the water fountain. And then there's a water fountain too. Is that good? Great, let's open with a word of prayer. Breathe on us the breath of God, that in our seeking of truth we may see your face and have compassion on your people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I want to add my word of welcome. I'm Don Blosser, member of the Planning Committee. We're delighted to have you here this evening. Michiana Voices for Middle East Peace emerged out of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne. We have a connection with Michael. I'll make a comment on that in a moment. Of persons who are concerned about peace in many places in the world, but particularly for this group in Israel-Palestine, what's happening there, and trying to inform and educate and help us understand how it is for people that live that way all the time. It's an honor, really, for me to introduce Michael Spath this evening. Michael is founder and executive director of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne. And thus, Michael is the driving impetus to Michiana Center for Middle East Peace, Michiana Voices for Middle East Peace. Michael has a doctorate in ministry in New Testament and a PhD in historical theology with an emphasis on Abrahamic religions. There's a lot more we could say about Michael, but I'd rather let him talk than me talk frequently. I'm curious, might I ask, how many of you here, any of you been on tours with Michael Holy Land? Oh, we have a treat coming then. Michael leads tours to Israel-Palestine. Most tours take you to good places, the tomb and the manger and the cross, all those places. Michael introduces you to people, and there's a difference in how that works. There's a lot more that could be said. I need to add a personal note in the sense of full disclosure. Michael and I share some ministry responsibilities at Emmaus Road Mennonite Fellowship in Bern. So I get a chance to interact with him somewhat regularly. I've seen him lead a Sunday school class with enthusiasm and installation of interest. I've heard him preach with creativity and resources up the kazoo. Michael is a good friend, and I'm delighted to welcome him here this evening to speak to us on the Fig Leaf Falls, how Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital might ultimately benefit the Palestinians. And I need to add, Michael, I don't see it. I hope you can persuade me. Welcome aboard, Mike.
Well, thanks for braving the cold weather to come out tonight. I first want to thank Michiana Voices for Middle East Peace, Don and John and Lloyd and Suella and Jonathan and others for the incredibly important and courageous, and it is courageous, work that you do in north central Indiana. We at Indiana Center for Middle East Peace are honored to be partners with Michiana Voices in our mutual supporting Palestinian sisters and brothers in their struggle for justice and full human and political rights. So he said, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, period. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It is also the right thing to do, unquote. And with that, the president overturns 70 years of consensus. They say, not since Harry Truman. 70 years of global consensus that Jerusalem is an international city, open to people of all faiths, and he predetermined the final status of the holy city. And this week, our former governor, Mr. Pence, was in Jerusalem, as you know, where it didn't take Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with, quote, "What a great honor it is to be in," wait for it, "Israel's capital, Jerusalem," then promising that President Trump has moved up the timetable to open the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem before the end of next year, 2019. All this while Pence, incredibly, is he just this naive, or is he being disingenuous? Quote, "We are at the dawn of a new era of negotiations for peace." He doesn't know how right he is, but not in the way he means it. After all, America has been no friend of the Palestinians. It's been a bipartisan unfriend. And this is, like some of you, I see faces of men, women, children, literally scores and scores of friends in the region who've shown extraordinary faith, extraordinary resilience in their response. So we need, first and foremost, to listen to our friends, our Palestinian partners. I've been told by more than one of my Palestinian friends that this isn't our problem, that we can't make their problem our problem. They have to solve it themselves. But then they go on, they continue to say, but you have your own problem, and your problem seriously impacts our problem. And how right they are. Every word, every subtle nuance, every ill-thought-out tweet has life and death consequences for the Palestinian people. To talk about Jerusalem is no simple task, if for no other reason than Jerusalem means different things to different people. So I have to listen very carefully, and you do too, when you hear Jerusalem in a conversation. Does it mean David's capital? Of course, this has all sorts of problematic historical issues associated with it. Most archaeological evidence suggests that David was at most, a tribal chieftain. Or the site Christians revere is the place of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. Or the third holiest site in Islam, the first direction of prayer, where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven to speak to God face to face. Or the spiritual center for religious Jews, included in their liturgies, a symbolic spiritual home. Or the focal point for Christian Zionists that needs to be re-inhabited by as many Jews as possible to fulfill end-time prophecy, a precursor to the Battle of Armageddon, the rapture, and Christ's messianic reign. Or the political capital of a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, the center for Palestinian nationalist aspiration, or the exclusive political capital of a Jewish state, undivided, eternal, between Israelis and Palestinians. Well, to start tonight, a brief history. 7 years ago, in 1947, the United Nations partitioned Palestine between a Jewish and Arab state, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem, what they call corpus separatum, a separate entity, an international territory administered by the United Nations. In 1949, Israel annexed West Jerusalem, depopulating it of Palestinian Christians and Muslims. Jordan annexed East Jerusalem, but the international community in 1949 refused both nations' claims. The 1967 war. Israel painted it, you might remember, I'm looking around, most of you are over 21. Israel painted it as little David facing the Arab Goliath. The international media's complicity called it, right, Israel's war of independence. Palestinians were left with only 22% of historic Palestine. Israel illegally annexing Palestinian East Jerusalem, which contains the major holy sites of all three monotheistic religions and the Old City, declaring Jerusalem its, quote, eternal, undivided capital. The annexation formalized in 1980 when Israel passed the so-called Jerusalem Law. We'll come back to that. In response, also in 1980, the UN declared Israel's annexation, quote, null and void, calling it, quote, a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention that it, quote, constituted a serious obstruction to achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. But this resolution has been routinely ignored by Israel and the United States, with Israel Judaizing the city, establishing its parliament and Supreme Court there, stripping more than 14,000 Palestinians of their residency, demolishing Palestinian homes, denying them building permits, building illegal settlements within East Jerusalem. And while the citizens of East Jerusalem pay their full share of taxes, they're denied basic municipal services. Think about that. Those of you who traveled there know this. They pay their full share of taxes, and yet I think I saw a figure that they receive about 18% of the services in return: trash pickup, upkeep of streets, schools, playgrounds, health care. In 1993, after signing the Oslo Accords, Palestinian PLO leader Yasser Arafat declared that there were three Palestinian constants: the right of return for refugees, a Palestinian state with self-rule. Remember, this is on the 22% of historic Palestine that was left for them, and with Jerusalem as its capital. So, fast forward. The U.S. Congress's Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995. That's what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks with the occupant of the White House. The U.S. Congress's Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 mandated that the United States move its embassy to Jerusalem within 5 years, with the proviso that the president could sign a waiver every 6 months that would keep the legislation from being implemented. The Jerusalem Embassy Act, co-sponsored in the Senate by such Democrats as Joe Biden and John Kerry, by the way, both of whom only got religion during the Netanyahu years, with only one Democrat, the late Robert Byrd, voting no. And in the House, just 30 out of 204 Democrats voted no, along with then the independent then Congressman Bernie Sanders. So Trump's decision didn't just come out of the blue. I mean, we like to pick on him, and I do regularly. But it didn't come out of the blue. It's been bipartisan all the way. Already in 1992, Bill Clinton promised that he and running mate Al Gore would support Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. However, once he became president, he determined the political cost would be too high. So he left the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 unsigned. He thought he could wait until the end of his second term to move the embassy in the very last stages of his presidency. Both George W. Bush and Barack Obama declared their personal view that Jerusalem was Israel's capital, but found the political realities too much to make it happen. They wanted to, but the political fallout would have been too much, they determined. During the Bush years, Israel began building the so-called separation barrier the apartheid wall, 28 feet tall, cutting off many Palestinian neighborhoods from the core of the city, with nary a peep from the U.S. administration. Every 6 months, presidents have signed the waiver. Every 6 months. In fact, the platforms of both the Republican and Democratic parties have called for recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, omitting that Jerusalem is the commercial, educational, cultural, and religious center of Palestinians too. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. The 2016 Democratic Party platform was very telling. Representatives for nominee Hillary Clinton, an advocate for moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, who said only that Palestinians deserve autonomy, was defeated by Bernie Sanders representatives Cornel West and Representative Keith Ellison, among others, including language from the Sanders group that Palestinians deserve independence and sovereignty along with dignity. That was their addition, and that won out over the Clinton group. That a Palestinian state, the Sanders people said, must be viable. The Clinton people wanted to veto that. Then, as recently as this past June, just days after Mr. Trump issued his first waiver of the requirement, the Senate voted, and I get this, the Senate voted 90-0 in favor of reaffirming the 1995 law, meaning that the president should move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and declare officially that Jerusalem was Israel's capital. 90-0. Calling on him to abide by its provisions, unquote. Co-sponsors included Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin from Maryland, ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, as well as Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Cory Booker, both of whom have presidential aspirations. And Schumer has openly lobbied the president to move the embassy ever since he came into office. We shouldn't kid ourselves about Trump's decision being some sort of radical break with the past. It's been a bipartisan support of declaring Jerusalem Israel's capital from the start and moving the embassy. And that's what makes it so, I was going to say sad, but it's more than sad. It makes me angry, and it's dangerous. But there's no question that the Zionist forces in our country, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have found a friend in Mr. Trump. We can't argue that. It's been well publicized that presidential son-in-law, Jared Kushner's family foundation, funds the hardline illegal settlement of Beit El outside Ramallah. And his UN ambassador, David Friedman, who, by the way, said, the settlements are all a part of Israel. And he talks about an alleged occupation. David Friedman is the president, or was the president until he was appointed ambassador, of American Friends of Beit El, this illegal settlement, and whose father's name, Rabbi Morris Friedman, graces several buildings in the settlement. So that's just a little bit of background. Mr. Trump's a master at marrying two contradictory forces in his base. On the one hand, there's this anti-Semitic, racist, alt-right movement. And on the other hand, the Zionist lobby. It makes your head spin. Including Christian Zionists who see the resettlement of Jews in Israel as a precursor to their ultimate redemption. What is it that ties these two strange bedfellows together? What's the bed on which they lie? Christian Zionism is a political movement wrapped up in biblical language. And our former governor, Mr. Pence is at the heart of it. He recently stated, he's one of the regular keynote speakers at Pastor John Hagee's Christians United for Israel Summit. So in 2016, Mr. Pence said, quote, "To look at Israel is to see that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob keeps his promises. The songs of the land and the people of Israel were the anthems of my youth. I support Israel because I'm a Christian." Presidential advisor Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention says, quote, I don't know anyone who's more consistent in bringing his evangelical Christian worldview to public policy than Mike Pence. And just this week, as if we needed reminding, Prime Minister Netanyahu welcomed Mike Pence to Israel, welcomed him to the Knesset by saying, "You were the first governor in the United States to push legislation to fight modern anti-Semitism and BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions." And he's right. Pence did. Pence returned the favor in his Knesset speech, using biblical language, drawing parallels between Jewish history and dating back to biblical times, and the European pilgrims who founded the United States. Quote, "Ours too is a story of exodus, a journey from persecution to freedom, recounting how the founding fathers of the U.S., quote, turned to the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible." Now, I get it that not all evangelicals are Christian Zionists. But the late Jerry Falwell used to say that give him a week and he could marshal 50 million signatures of evangelicals in support of the state of Israel, even more than he could on the issues of abortion or gay rights. Israel was the linchpin to evangelical support, Falwell used to say. And today, Franklin Graham with Mr. Pence lead Trump's evangelical cheerleaders. Now, some folks say that evangelicals are just cynically using Mr. Trump to achieve their Christian dominionist agenda. They say it's just a cynical marriage of convenience. Now, while that might be partially true, I believe it's much worse than that. The evangelical supporters of Mr. Trump's base justify their support for Trump theologically, saying that just as God chose in the Old Testament the adulterer, the sinner, David, to build a great kingdom, and just as 2.5 millennia ago, God chose the pagan Persian king Cyrus, who Isaiah called the Messiah, so also it is in our day. God is choosing another imperfect yet strong leader to accomplish God's purposes. This isn't just a cynical marriage. This is supported and legitimized, justified theologically. No wonder the religious right's left behind theology has found an ally with Israel. Their triumphalist biblical interpretation allows that human rights are, forgive me, trumped because of divine right. Human rights are trumped because of divine right, they say. Mr. Trump's evangelical base, and this is the marriage, this is what ties these two together. Mr. Trump's evangelical base believes in a warrior God, a muscular Jesus, the church militant, and a rugged individualism, and an American exceptionalism and expansionism built on manifest destiny and Christian nationalism. Let me say that again. Mr. Trump's evangelical base believes in a warrior God, a muscular Jesus, the church militant, a rugged individualism, and an American exceptionalism and expansionism built on manifest destiny and Christian nationalism, all supported and justified by a racist, market-based, muscular religion. These are the ties that bind the two strange bedfellows of Zionists and anti-Semites. In their response to Trump's decision, the leaders of 13 Christian denominations in Palestine and Israel boycotted Mr. Trump's visit, stating in an open letter that the U.S. decision will, quote, do irreparable harm and increased hatred, conflict, violence, and suffering in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Palestinian stores and businesses across the city and all across the West Bank were shuttered to protest the Vice President's visit. And think about this. Given how Christians have been persecuted and killed by ISIS throughout the Middle East, most telling of all, retired Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Michael Spath, said that quote, the most pressing threat facing Christians is not a terror group, but the White House. Quote, our fear is not from our people, from Muslims. Our fear comes from America, he told CNN. Recently, the Israeli Knesset passed the so-called race law. It's called the United Jerusalem Bill. Notice the wordsmithing. The United Jerusalem Bill, which makes it virtually impossible for the city to be divided to make room for a Palestinian capital in the future. It includes illegal settlements within the city boundaries and excludes entire Palestinian neighborhoods. And in addition to its brutal treatment of Sephardic Jewish, in its brutal treatment of Palestinians inside and outside the country, it does that. Israel's white Ashkenazi Jews, the European Jews, discriminate against its non-white Sephardic, North African and Middle Eastern Jewish citizens. And in case you have any doubts about this, the start of 2018 marks the first stages of the Israeli government's plan to deport 40,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia, currently living in Israel. If they don't leave on their own, those who remain face a choice: deportation or prison. Sound familiar? Majority Likud party members Miki Zohar, Bezalel Smotrich, and Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked. Ayelet Shaked is a real deal. She's the Minister of Justice who said, quote, Palestinians are snakes to be exterminated. Minister of Justice. They said in an interview, a Palestinian has no right to national self-determination since he doesn't own the land in this country. Out of decency, he can stay as a resident since he was born and lives here. We won't tell him to leave. I'm sorry to say this, but they have one major disadvantage. They weren't born as Jews. That's why the Black Lives Movement and Native American activists have found common cause with the Palestinian Liberation Movement. The militarization of police, the use of incarceration, racial profiling, and targeting youth as a method of control, all are prevalent in both urban America and the occupied West Bank. Well, these are a few things of the more important things that have happened since Trump's decision. Israel is expanding its illegal settlements surrounding and within Jerusalem by 14,000 new housing units just in the last month and a half, as well as plans to annex the entire West Bank. January 16th, the U.S. decided to decrease its funding from $195 million to $60 million. $195 million to $60 million to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. For 70 years, UNRWA has provided food, education, health care, social services, and employment to the 5 million Palestinian refugees in the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Trump made clear that this was in retaliation to Palestinian resistance following his decision to recognize Jerusalem, as well as part of his strange logic that this will motivate Palestinians to renew their negotiations with Israel. And worst of all, and this kind of flew under the radar screen, there are also reports that the U.S., this is the U.S., wants to adopt an Israeli plan to redefine refugee to just the first generation from 1948, who of course are fast dying out. Number 3. In a stinging rebuke, 128 countries, including some of the United States' most trusted and reliable allies, voted in favor of a UN resolution calling for a reversal of the U.S. decision. Only 9 countries voted against it. Ambassador Nikki Haley replied that the vote was an insult and said the U.S. was, quote, you remember, taking names, threatening to withhold funding from the UN, and for his part, Mr. Trump threatened to withhold billions of dollars in aid for countries voting against the U.S. and the UN. And number 4. Now, I wish we could have had a whole evening just on this. The Israeli occupation forces ramped up their arrests, detention, and imprisonment of Palestinians, especially youth. According to Adamir, a prisoner support organization, Israel detained almost 7,000 Palestinians in 2017, including more than 1,400 children. And the child prison population in Israeli military prisons has doubled in the last 3 years. Many of you may have been following the Ahed Tamimi case. Just this past June, my group was in their home in Nabi Saleh. Had a wonderful afternoon with Bassem and Nariman and Ahed and other members of their family. She's now, of course, in Ofer military prison, still awaiting trial along with her mother for attempting to keep Israeli military from coming into their home. So Don, this one's for you. How is Trump's decision harmful? Well, the deck is stacked. I'll just mention a few of the reasons why the U.S. decision is so harmful to the parties involved. It reinforces fallacious Zionist thinking that not only Jerusalem, but the entire country, including historic Palestine, rightfully belongs to Israel. Israel's annexation of Jerusalem is not recognized by any country other than Israel and now the United States. It provides a pretext for the retroactive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from West Jerusalem and historic Palestine since 1948 without any compensation. And the current regime of house demolitions, destruction of orchards and other property, illegal settlements, martial law, land annexation, and underfunding health, housing, education, sanitation services for the Palestinians. 3, it demonstrates the U.S. contempt for the Fourth Geneva Convention, protection of civilians in a war zone and under occupation. Contempt for international law, the World Court, and the United Nations, and it violates 7 decades of U.S. policy, official policy. Number 4, it shows contempt for the Arab world and impacts vital U.S. interests all over the region. You might remember that no-dove Secretary of Defense James Mattis noted in 2013, quote, "I paid a military security price every day as a commander of the Central Command because the Americans were seen as biased in support of Israel." That's James Mattis. 5, it reinforces the Israeli, by the way, and Saudi, talk about strange bedfellows, Israeli and Saudi and U.S., religious and political right. Reinforces that narrative that Iran is the source of instability in the Middle East rather than the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Number 6, important Christian and Muslim shrines will become even more inaccessible to their faithful, including 2 billion Muslims. 7, the denial of accessibility to holy sites would undercut and weaken those Palestinians sacrificing their lives in the cause of nonviolent resistance. 8, it gives implicit support to Israel's increased crackdown on denying people of conscience entry, especially Christian and Jewish groups. Recently, as you know, Israel named 20 organizations whose leaders will be denied entry into the country, including U.S. Campaign for Human Rights, Jewish Voice for Peace, those 2 I'm a member of, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. Your own Jonathan Brenneman is an expert in being banned. And Jonathan can talk much more eloquently than I about what that means. Number 9, it provides an excuse for new waves of persecution against Christians living as minorities in Islamic countries. Jewish Israeli activist attorney Danny Seidemann puts it like this: Jerusalem is not usually the explosive device. It's usually the detonator. There is almost invariably one thing, and one thing only, that creates the spark, and that is the real or perceived threat to sacred space. Number 10, it will encourage violent attacks, including terrorism, targeting U.S. interests and U.S. citizens abroad. And number 11, it would cause a backlash of, and really, this is the irony, it would cause a backlash of anti-Semitism around the world. There are many Jewish peace groups in Europe and the U.S. who oppose Mr. Trump's decision for this very reason. And number 12, it strengthens U.S. Zionist groups in silencing Palestinian and other peace voices at home, in communities, on campuses, in state houses, and in the U.S. Congress, where all kinds of bills are being proposed to keep people and companies from supporting, giving voice to boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So Don, you're right. That period, comma. So, how might Mr. Trump's decision on Jerusalem, how might it be something positive? By the way, it might not. Either in the short term or the long term. It can be positive only if we, I'll return to this at the end, only if we at Indiana Center, only if we, Michiana Voices, only if we, you folks here, and folks like us, people of conscience around the country, step up our game. Number 1. We can highlight the concerted, well-funded, and it is well-funded, spin on all things Israel in the United States and around the world. There is an entire Israeli cabinet-level ministry dedicated to Hasbara propaganda. A helpful primer, by the way, I'd encourage you, if you haven't shown it up here, I'd encourage you. A new must-see documentary that we showed in Fort Wayne. The Occupation of the American Mind. And in it, for example, it shows the role of Republican pollster Frank Luntz, who wrote, and you can read this online, I mean, it's an interesting, fascinating position paper, white paper, the Israel Project's 2009 Global Language Dictionary, advising the Israeli government in how to frame the issues so that it will sell, so that Israel will sell around the world. Type in Luntz and the Israel Project's 2009 Global Language Dictionary. It's a fascinating, fascinating read. Number 2, it's no secret that the Palestinian Authority is at best disrespected and at worst held in contempt by the majority of Palestinians. It's viewed as either inept and ineffectual or a puppet regime, collaborators in the daily oppression of the Palestinian population. As unlikely as it might be, might this moment in history bring the parties together and give a newfound backbone to Palestinian leadership? Question. What would happen if the PA, Palestinian Authority, just decided to cut off all contact with the U.S. administration, further isolating the administration in its attempt to make so-called peace? It would show a resolve, I contend, that we haven't seen yet from Palestinian leadership in decades. Would there be a price to pay in the short term? For sure. But in the end, it would begin the process of unifying their political leaders, thank God. Wondering both about their courage and their creativity. Not willing to settle for the few crumbs that the Israeli and U.S. masters toss them to keep them appeased. Palestinians aged 15 to 30 make up 35% of the population in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. 3/4 of them are university students. And they're not sitting on their hands. They've taken their protests to the streets, organizing through social media, and finding all kinds of creative ways, artistic and otherwise, to undermine their Israeli masters. Creative resistance bypassing their Palestinian political leaders. I place a cautious hope in the bottom-up grassroots movement of young Palestinians, much like in the first Intifada. And we need to be investing in them. Trump's decision gives the lie to 5 myths. That the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict. It's not a conflict. As if we have 2 equal sides fighting with each other. And it's not an occupation either, which implies a temporary period of time when one group occupies another space. This is permanent. And if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's genocide. Where Israel is either forcibly removing people from the country or physically creating the conditions that cause population transfer or ethnic cleansing. Number 3, the myth that there is such a thing as a peace process. It's better formulated as a capitulation process. And 4, that the U.S. is or ever has been or even ever can be a fair mediator between both sides. And number 5, the fig leaf really has fallen. It gives the lie to the possibility of a 2-state solution. I mean, maybe there was a time decades and decades ago, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never believed that there was a 2-state solution possible. Never. But at least ever since Oslo, when the number of settlements expanded exponentially, the 2-state solution has been dead. You know, Trump might achieve what the settlements and land theft and population transfer could not do. He might finally have been the one able to shatter the illusion of 2 states for the world to see and to give it its proper name. Apartheid. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, put it like this: we're presently involved not only in a conflict with our Arab neighbors, but to some extent with most of mankind as it's organized in the United Nations because of Jerusalem. It must be clear that there is no room in the country for both peoples. There's no room here for compromise. There's no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, to transfer all of them, save perhaps for Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Old Jerusalem. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. So while the vice president was in Jerusalem, President Mahmoud Abu Mazen was in Brussels calling upon the European Union to recognize the Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. Over 135 nations have already recognized a Palestinian state. Sweden's recognition is now official, while parliaments in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Spain, France, Luxembourg, along with the EU Parliament, have all approved recognition. And you know, I don't want to be Pollyanna here, because there's a real argument taking place within the EU itself about support for Palestinian rights. But in the world of realpolitik, following Trump's Jerusalem declaration, all indications are that more countries are moving to recognize Palestine. Will the EU step into the breach of trust left open by the U.S.? Will it? At Davos, there's a big speech tomorrow. At Davos this week, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron both asserted a European resurgence and strength, rejecting Trumpism. Will they reject Netanyahuism too? Especially as Trump doubles down in his support of Israel. Will they both bring each other down? Will the EU stand up to America on this issue and deal with Israel and its American enablers? Ohio-born Palestinian entrepreneur and businessman Sam Bahor. The international community must rise to the occasion and demonstrate that it's squandering its money and credibility by indulging in American charades of impartiality. Once it finally acknowledges this reality, it will find the strength to propose its own policies in line with its international law, the UN Charter, and its own moral standards. Number 8. Support among younger American Jews for Israel is eroding, plunging 32% between 2010 and 2016. And, well, let's face it, what else can you call it? The bromance between the American president and Netanyahu, the Israel Trump, or is Trump the American Netanyahu, their bromance is hurting both of them among moderates. Young American Jews find Zionist triumphalism and America's white exceptionalism, both Jewish and Christian, repugnant, opposed to their progressive values. I want to say a word. I want to say a word about BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is number 9, and other forms of resistance. For example, the No Way to Treat a Child initiative that's finding traction in the U.S. Congress. We must turn up the heat and pursue BDS even more vigorously, personally, on campuses and in communities, and at the state, national, and international level. We just have to turn up the heat. BDS is the way. In Fort Wayne this year, we're beginning an advocacy initiative in partnership with Defense for Children International and the American Friends Service Committee we call Kinship with Kids Palestine. And we're going to take our educational focus in Fort Wayne and turn it into advocacy. And this just came across my desk this morning. Just 2 weeks ago, the Pew Research Center conducted a poll of over 1,500 adults. Their findings? 79% of Republicans say they sympathize more with Israel than the Palestinians, compared with just 27% of Democrats. But in the last 15 years, Republicans sympathizing more with Israel than Palestinians has increased 29 points, but the Democrats has decreased by 11 points. And moderate and conservative Democrats continue to sympathize more with Israel, 35% than Palestinians, but that number has declined 18 points since 2016. So the point is the trajectory is heading in the right way. Now I should say that as you talk to our Palestinian friends in Israel and Palestine, they'll tell you, don't sympathize with us and don't sympathize with the Israelis. Support justice. Support justice. And that's what we're asking. we need to further isolate Israel by boycotting not only goods and services from the settlements, but impose sanctions, economic, cultural, artistic, intellectual, and political, on Israel en toto. En toto. Isolation of Israel on the world stage. That's what BDS is about. Just like we did in South Africa in the 80s, Israel must be isolated as a pariah state on the world stage. And it's not a bad thing that Trump's decision further isolates the United States on the world stage too. Trumpism doesn't sell. I want to be clear. I want to be really clear about this. Israel has every right to determine the location of its capital, as long as that location is within its own internationally recognized borders. However, as Jerusalem, I'll just say it, Jerusalem is not in Israel, according to international law, the World Court, the United Nations. So the real issue here is that Trump's decision, like Netanyahu's position, thumbs its nose at the UN and international law, further isolating both countries. Prominent South Africa judge and former UN Special Rapporteur John Dugard put it like this: Palestine today has become the litmus test for the West's respect for human rights. The West's respect for human rights. Just as South Africa once was. If the West fails to end its fatal collusion with Israel's regime of apartheid and colonialism, it will lose, it has lost all credibility around the world. So in order, number 11, to be most effective, we must also increase our partnership with intersectional allies. The Black Lives Movement, the Standing Rock, Native American liberation struggle, Jewish and Muslim and LGBTQ and women's and climate justice, and all liberation voices seeking a fuller humanity and planet sustainability. As we saw, that's beginning to happen. How can we continue to nudge the process forward? Are we in it for the long haul? Having said that, there's an urgency as Israel is increasing its own internal apartheid and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. We don't want to get to a point where it's too late. Where it's too late. That's my fear. We don't want to get to a point where it's too late, like with Native Americans in this land. Most important of all, we need to reach out over the ocean to establish creative partnerships with friends in Palestine and Israel and support them politically, spiritually, and economically. And number 12, finally, last June, the National Coalition of Christian Organizations in Palestine, 33 Palestinian Christian organizations, published an open letter sent to Christians all over the world. Did you get it? Did you read it? 33 Palestinian Christian organizations sent it to Christians around the world. This is in part what it said. 100 years since Balfour, we stand at an impasse, have reached a deadlock. Humanly speaking, we have reached the moment of impossible. We need your costly solidarity. This is not a time for shallow diplomacy Christians. Things are beyond urgent. We're on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. The status quo is unsustainable. This could be our last chance to achieve a just peace. And as a Palestinian Christian community, this could be our last opportunity to save the Christian presence in this land. Just let that sink in. It moves me to tears, but it moves me to activism. And I hope it does you too. Well, I'm going to wrap it up. So might Trump's decision turn out to be a positive for Palestinians? Well, you'll have to ask Don. While it's not only up to us, it certainly is also up to us, especially American Christians and their churches. Our Christian friends in Palestine, and Muslims too, covet. They need the weight of presence and protest that the international community brings. They've been betrayed by an heretical Christian Zionist triumphalism, and that places a moral imperative upon the heart of other Christians, upon us, to stand in solidarity with them, our Palestinian sisters and brothers. Not to do so betrays our own, if you're a Christian, our own commitment to Christ. By the way, it betrays our own humanity. They have paid and are ready to continue to pay a heavy price for liberation, for freedom, for independence. Even in the face of overwhelming power marshaled against us, Israel and the U.S. too is fully aware of the power of the many faces of creative resistance in both countries. I am a believer in the power of grassroots movements like this here in Michiana, in Goshen, in Elkhart. An alliance of Palestinians, Israeli peace groups, Jewish peace groups, Christian denominations, campus organizations, community and faith-based groups, international solidarity. As Israel and the U.S. government, as they pass more laws and measures attempting to stifle the voices of justice, they not only isolate themselves in the eyes of the world more, but they increasingly demonstrate their exclusivist and racist foundations. In other words, their retrenchment and increasing intolerance shows that we're winning. Just like during Nazi Germany, people of conscience said, we're all Jews. And just like during the 60s and 70s in the United States, especially in the South, people of conscience said, we're all black. Today, we, people of conscience in this country and around the world, but especially we in this country, must say, we're proudly, we must say it in no uncertain terms, we're proudly, we're fully, we're all Palestinian. Will we stand with them? Will we make sacrifices here in our lives, here in this community, here in Indiana, here in the United States? Will we make sacrifices in solidarity on their behalf? Our commitment, our solidarity, will in a large part answer the question of whether or not this decision will have positive results for Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You're getting me. You're getting to me. Questions, comments? Let's engage Michael for a bit.
Well, we have a number of other experts in the room here, so I may defer to them as well.
Yes, come on.
A number of months ago, there was news of Netanyahu and his family being corrupt, which I honestly believe is thoroughly true. And the Knesset was investigating that. And I hoped that, I prayed that some core Jewish beliefs of morality would mean that would have an effect on things. That spark to me I haven't heard anything about it. What has happened? Would that even make a difference if he were prosecuted?
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me if I talk here? Should I go up to the podium on the radio? I feel so far away.
What?
You can use this one.
Okay, I'm going to get in a second. Thank you, Don. Thank you for the question. All I will say is that the investigation, as far as I know, still continues. Having said that, I gave a talk this past Thursday night, a week ago, at Fort Wayne on race and religion in Donald Trump's America 1 year in. And I said then that Donald Trump is not the problem, he's the symptom of the problem, but he's exposed the problem, and that is a white, racist American exceptionalism. And I would say the same thing about Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, he's Israeli white exceptionalism on steroids, but he's a symptom. He's not. I mean, would Israel be better off if he was out of power? There are people further to the right than him in his own party that he tries to appease on a regular basis. That's a tough one that you ask. If it would be better if he's gone. The whole system is the issue. It's a systemic problem, just like it is here in the United States. But as far as I know, the investigation continues. Nelson.
Ben Nelson Crago from the Mennonite World Conference. Thank you, Michael, for this. And I find myself largely agreeing with you. I mean, I think what you present is accurate and valid. And not long ago, I was at that Beit El settlement, not to visit with the settlers, but to see the archaeological site there where, according to tradition, Jacob had his vision, ladder to heaven.
Right.
And Jacob gets this vision from God of, through the Jewish people, all nations being blessed, all nations. Abraham gets that too. And that sort of encapsulates something of my hope for Israel-Palestine, that this can be a place where Palestinians and Jews are blessed. And my concern that I'd like to hear you address is the kind of presentation we had tonight. Well, you're sort of singing to the choir here, largely.
Of course.
So you don't have to be terribly diplomatic, and that's okay. It's a little bit in-house here, because probably we mostly agree, and I'm glad we agree. But I work with the global Mennonite Church, and I have contact with Zionists. And I lead tours and sometimes have a few Zionists with me. I find that the way that very large sector of the Christian church views what we're doing here is just beating up on Israel and ignoring God's promises. And there's a kind of, I would say, even strident tone to what we're doing tonight that I fear has a reactivity that's counterproductive, and can be counterproductive if we're not careful with how we use that. And I'm looking for allies among the Zionists, and I'm looking for allies among the Jewish people. I don't have a lot of entree there, but I wish for that, where we could look for what are our areas of agreement, and how can we as Christians validate the existence of Israel. And I would just state my personal conviction. I'm kind of glad if the capital of the Jewish nation is in Jerusalem. Now, that's just the first part of my thought. The second thought is, okay, what does this mean for the Palestinians and their legitimate rights? So if you could address that concern, what we can, as Christians, can validate and publicly state about support for Israel, and then the concern that how we speak this ends up having a reactivity that's counterproductive.
You've asked a very difficult question. Now, Simon, whether you know it or not, it's very difficult. I'm a recovering Lutheran. So I come out of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And so I come out of a tradition that was predominantly Zionist, supported unconditionally for Israel. There's so many levels to what you're saying. I want to agree, I want to disagree, I want to parse it. I would say this, that our Jewish friends here in the United States have been my teachers with regard to this. I'm not talking about liberal Zionists so much as I'm talking about Jewish Voice for Peace and other folks. You may know that there's a group called J Street. They, security for Israel, security for Palestine, peace for all, all shared. We all get along. Here's the problem. I have found that dialogue, that term. I've been involved with Jewish-Christian dialogue for most of my adult life. Back when I was in my 20s as a young pastor, 7 Jewish rabbis, 7 pastors, we got together in each other's homes for 8 years. Every month, over the summer as well, talking about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism. But those were the days when dialogue really meant Christians needed to fess up to their own inherent anti-Semitism in their scriptures and in their tradition, and in their Holocaust, and their involvement with, support in Nazi Germany. I was a part of the groundbreaking and dedication of the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center in St. Louis. So I've been involved with Jewish-Christian dialogue for many, many years now. Having said all that, dialogue for me, and I know this might be not sufficient for you, the dialogue for me anymore has become a shibboleth. It's become a stalling tactic that Zionists use, that the Israeli government uses, to keep us from dealing with the elephant in the room. Oslo, the height of all of the optimism that went along with Oslo in the mid-1990s. That was supposed to begin the beginning of a wonderful cohabitation of the Holy Land, Israelis and Palestinians living in peace together. And so while these Palestinians were dialoguing and living up to their end of the bargain, Israelis increased, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, increased the number of settlements 5, 6, 8-fold. Dialogue has been used by Zionists to cover further domination. So I'm cynical anymore when people start talking to me about dialogue. Now, I understand as a local Christian leader, as a tour leader, as a pastor, as just an activist community, I understand that puts us in tough positions. I guess what I'm trying to do in my own work, and again, this is going to be unsatisfying to you. I'm trying to hold fast to this vision of justice, what this looks like, and forget that loaded biblical term, just fairness. And I keep my eye on the ball and take that wherever it leads me. I'll say one other thing. I mentioned this the other night on my race and religion talk in Fort Wayne. And it's not about you. I'm talking about myself here. I'm talking about myself. In his letter to the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. holds out his greatest scorn for who? Not for Bull Connor, not for the white movements, the Citizens Action Council in Alabama. Who was it? It was what he called the white moderates. The white moderates who really saying, well, now is not the time, or we need to try to get along, or we need to, work within the system. And they were the ones who were the major obstacles to racial progress. And I have had to look myself in the mirror. I've had to look myself in the mirror and say, hey, Mike, how much are you one of these white progressives? These progressives who want to play nice. I mean, heck, I like to be liked. I don't, all appearances to the contrary, I don't want to stir up trouble. I don't do that by nature. I do that now by vocation. But it doesn't come natural to me. So do we need to reach out to Zionist friends? Yes. The best way to do that is what you do. You introduce them to people. You take them there. Let them see with their own eyes. You ask questions. You drop hints. There's no magic pill, as you know. It's through personal relationships. How does anybody ever change their heart, change their mind? It's a process. It doesn't happen from the neck up first, right? It has to happen in the heart and in the guts. And that's what changes the head. But I want to get to other questions, I know, but this is a very, you didn't mean to do this, but your question caused me to point an accusing finger at myself, because when I've thought this way, it takes the steam out of my justice work, because I want to reach out to this group, and I want to reach out to this group, and be nice and point it, and it takes my eye off the ball. So I'm sorry that I didn't really answer your question very satisfactorily.
You did marvelous.
Other than to say, if you take your commitment to Christ seriously, and the incoming rule, the reign of God, and let the chips fall. And that's my work these days. I may not be the best model. I may not be the best one to answer your question satisfactorily. So forgive me for that.
I got a comment, because you have spoken for a lot of us, and Nelson's question is one that a lot of us wrestle with. How do we do it? And you're on target with this.
Well, I'm a person. When I first came to, I'll just very quickly, do you mind? Thank you. When I first moved to Fort Wayne, because of my activity with Jews in St. Louis, I mean, like I said, I was St. Louis World Religions Dialogue, Holocaust Museum learning, etc., etc. So when I moved to Fort Wayne as a university professor, I took students to the temple, and I was beloved by the Jewish community. In fact, at the Holocaust Remembrance Service, the Yom HaShoah service, I was the only one given an opportunity to speak without notes, without a script. They said, Mike, you've got 8 minutes or so at the beginning of the service, say whatever you want to say. And I did them proud. But as I got more and more involved in Palestinian activism in Fort Wayne, I became a persona non grata, literally. I mean, literally. And I live a block from the temple. So I paid a price in terms of personal relationships. In terms of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, we've been regularly maligned, and myself in the newspaper, letters to the editor and the rest. So I take no joy in my answer to you. And like I said, that may be what makes me not the best person possible to answer your question. But you got to let the chips fall, man. I mean, that's where I am in my life, and I feel much freer, though. Having made that decision, I feel much freer.
30 seconds, Michael, I want you to...
I'm sorry.
Hey, you're doing fine. We've got Robert Cohen coming, and it seems to me he will address this same issue, won't he?
Yep, ask him. And be blunt, and ask all these folks bluntly like you did me. I mean, this is a hard question.
Anybody else? Jump in, yes.
So the two-state idea is dead. So tomorrow if someone asks me, okay, what is the solution? What are our goals? Like, could you summarize what you said this evening in maybe a paragraph?
Sure, I can do that. You know what? You may find this hard to believe, but you're not the first person who asked me to summarize what I have tried to say. Yeah. Well, let me say first that the two-state solution, this isn't just my opinion. Go there and see. Israel has not only control of its own, Israel, the 78%, but it has effective control of the 22% of the West Bank and Palestine. Regular military incursions, the checkpoints, the lack of being able to move around, their own country. Like I say, these kids' arrests in their own living rooms, bedrooms. To try to say that there's a two-state solution possible, you just look at the map, right? Mitri Radeb, who you all know, he's the Bethlehem Lutheran minister. You've heard this. He says, Palestine is like Swiss cheese, where Israel has the cheese and we get the holes, right? So how do you make a viable, contiguous country out of that? So the question becomes, what does this one state look like? Well, it could be confederations, it could be two people living side by side. The sky's the limit. One person who's doing a lot of good work in this, and I happen to be newly on his board in the United States, is a man named Jeff Halper, a Jewish anthropologist in Israel itself. He's convened in Exeter just this month Jewish, Israeli, and Arab Muslim and Arab Christian activists, scholars, and others who are trying to come up with a number of different possibilities for what this one state might look like. And so, in the end, it's going to be their decision. This is why I think Omar Barghouti, the head of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement in Ramallah, Palestinian activist, right now he says, let's wait and see what this one state's going to look like. Right now, we need to dismantle the apartheid state that exists. And so that's what many of us in the United States are doing, trying to dismantle, isolate this apartheid regime, and then we want the people on the ground, we'll let them work out among themselves what this one state might look like. There are a number of possibilities, but we won't know what that, if it even has a possibility, until the present regime dies.
We got time for one more. We're committed to closing here in about 4 minutes. So that puts the threat on people. Lloyd, I'd like you to come and give an explanation, 1 minute, on what you've got.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to be here.
We have a little brochure here that I'd like for each of you to take. It has listed the programs that we have scheduled for the rest of the spring. We have 3 more scheduled, and would invite you to put that in your calendars. Back at the entrance, if you would like to have your name and email address available to us, we'd be glad to put you on our mailing list and make sure that you have up-to-date information. Another way of staying in touch is on Facebook. Go in and search Michiana Voices for Middle East Peace and become a friend. And then you will routinely get the information that comes from this planning group as we continue to find people, invite people to address us on a variety of issues.
Again, thank you all for coming out this evening. Appreciate your presence, your interest, ask questions. John Jr., how do you identify yourself from your father, John? John chairs our committee. He can answer questions. Lola Gerber's here. She can help. Mike was back here and others. The names are on the paper, I think. We're glad to have you here. We'd like to see you again. You have information about next meeting coming up with Sunitha Millsaps. Michael, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. Sunitha wants to look at the African American situation and tie it in with the Palestinian situation about
Very
government
important.
control.
I can't miss, don't want to miss program for Michiana Voices. You want to be here for that. It's very timely, very important. I'm so grateful that you're doing that program.
Thank you. Thanks, gang. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks.